10. Black music legends, hated by their children. You'll be shocked to know why. The world calls them legends, icons, voices that defined generations of black music. But what if the people who knew them best, their own children, remember something very different? Behind the sold-out arenas, platinum records and standing ovations were homes filled with silence, fear, distance, and questions that were never answered. This is not about canceling greatness. It's about confronting the cost of it. Stay with us as we uncover the family truths history avoided and ask whether fame is worth the damage it leaves behind. Subscribe to Legends of Black Excellence and join the conversation many are afraid to start. James Brown. James Brown is remembered as one of the most disciplined and commanding figures in American music history. Known as the Godfather of Soul, he sold over 50 million records worldwide, placed more than 100 singles on the Billboard charts, and built an empire on precision control and relentless work ethic. On stage, James Brown demanded perfection. Musicians were fined for missed notes. Dancers rehearsed endlessly, and performances were executed with military sharpness. That same mindset, however, did not stay confined to the spotlight. It followed him home, shaping a family environment many of his children later described as intimidating rather than nurturing. Brown acknowledged at least 9 children with multiple partners and consistently provided financial support, including housing, schooling, and living expenses. Materially, his children were never abandoned. Emotionally, the story was far more complicated. Several family members later stated that access to their father depended heavily on his mood and authority. Conversations were cautious. Rules shifted without warning. Approval felt conditional, and silence often felt safer than honesty. One son publicly described growing up surrounded by luxury, but lacking emotional security where discipline was enforced through fear rather than explanation. If success gives someone power, does it also give them permission to rule their own family? Brown's wealth amplified his control. He decided where family members lived when they visited and how much independence they were allowed. Support could be withdrawn abruptly, reinforcing obedience over trust. These dynamics did not always involve physical violence, but they created a persistent atmosphere of unpredictability that left lasting psychological effects. Public records between the late 1980s and early 2000s show multiple arrests related to aggressive behavior and substance use, reinforcing a broader pattern of volatility that family members later said mirrored what they experienced privately. When James Brown died in December 2006 at age 73, unresolved tensions resurfaced. His estate, valued at tens of millions of dollars, became the subject of prolonged legal battles involving children and extended relatives. Lawsuits challenged wills, trusts, and control over assets, reopening emotional wounds that had never healed. For many of his children, the conflict was not simply about money. It symbolized a lifetime of unilateral decisions made without dialogue. Importantly, several of Brown's children have said they continue to respect his musical genius. Their pain was not rooted in hatred of his legacy, but in the difficulty of reconciling the global icon with the father they knew. Therapy, distance, and limited contact became coping strategies rather than acts of rebellion. James Brown changed the sound of modern music forever, yet his family story raises an uncomfortable truth. Authority can build legends, but without empathy, it can quietly dismantle parenthood. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye remains one of the most emotionally expressive voices in American music history. His catalog, including What's Going On, Let's Get It On, and Sexual Healing, sold over 40 million records worldwide and redefined how black male vulnerability could sound in popular music. To the public, Marvin Gaye embodied tenderness, intimacy, and spiritual reflection. To his children, however, he was a man shaped by deep psychological wounds long before fame arrived. Gaye grew up under the authority of his father, Marvin Gaye Sr., a strict Pentecostal minister who ruled the household through fear, humiliation, and physical punishment. Family accounts later confirmed that beatings were frequent and affection rare. That childhood left lasting scars. As Marvin rose to stardom in the 1960s and 1970s, he carried unresolved trauma into adulthood, struggling with severe depression, paranoia, and substance dependence, particularly cocaine. His success did not bring stability. It intensified pressure. As a father, Marvin Gaye was described by his children as loving but inconsistent. There were moments of warmth, generosity, and deep emotional connection, followed by long periods of absence and unpredictability. Financial stress, record label disputes, and mounting drug use increasingly dominated his life. By the early 1980s, his mental health had deteriorated dramatically. Friends and family noted erratic behavior, heightened fear, and emotional exhaustion. In 1983, overwhelmed by debt and instability, Marvin moved back into his parents' Los Angeles home, a decision many close to him feared. Police records later documented repeated domestic disturbances at the residence. Decades of unresolved conflict between father and son resurfaced under one roof. On April 1, 1984, just one day before Marvin's 45th birthday, an argument escalated. Marvin Gaye Sr. shot his son with a handgun. The coroner ruled the death a homicide. His father later pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter and received probation due to poor health. For Marvin Gaye's children, the trauma did not end with his death. They lost their father in an act of violence that was impossible to separate from a lifetime of abuse. Interviews given years later reveal lasting psychological effects, including anxiety, distrust of authority, and difficulty reconciling their father's peaceful music with the violence that ended his life. Estate disputes followed, further complicating grief and prolonging emotional strain. Marvin Gaye's music continues to comfort and inspire millions, often serving as a soundtrack for healing and reflection. Yet for his family, healing required confronting a harsher truth. Artistic brilliance did not erase generational trauma. Silence did not stop violence. His story stands as a sobering reminder that unaddressed pain does not disappear with success, it waits, and it echoes. Ike Turner. Ike Turner occupies a complicated place in American music history. Long before his name became synonymous with scandal, he was a groundbreaking innovator who helped shape early rock and roll and rhythm and blues. His 1951 recording, Rocket 88, is often cited as one of the first rock songs ever recorded. Turner was a gifted band leader, arranger, and producer whose influence stretched far beyond the spotlight. Yet inside his home, the environment his children grew up in was defined not by creativity, but by instability. By the late 1960s and 1970s, Ike Turner's career ran parallel with escalating cocaine addiction, something he later acknowledged publicly. Substance dependence fueled mood swings, paranoia, and explosive behavior that did not stop when the music ended. According to multiple family accounts and Tina Turner's documented testimony, volatility became routine. Arguments erupted without warning. Calm could turn to chaos in minutes. For the children living in that household, unpredictability became the norm. Ronnie Turner, born in 1960 to Ike and Tina Turner, spent his childhood surrounded by conflict. While he was not the direct target of abuse described by his mother, he witnessed its aftermath: injuries, hidden rehearsals continuing as if nothing happened, silence replacing explanation. Other children, including Ike Turner Jr. and Linda Tripp Turner, later described growing up in an atmosphere where obedience was expected and questioning authority carried risk. Love existed, but it was conditional and inconsistent. When fear becomes routine, can a child ever feel truly safe, even without being touched? As the children grew older, emotional distance became a survival strategy. Some limited contact. Others changed their surnames or left the household as soon as they were able. These decisions were often misunderstood by the public, who continued to see Ike Turner primarily through the lens of musical achievement. To his children, withdrawal was not betrayal. It was relief. Silence offered protection where confrontation never had. When allegations of abuse became widely known in the 1980s and 1990s, Many expected his children to defend him publicly. Most did not. Some chose to speak honestly. Others said nothing at all. Both responses reflected years of unresolved harm rather than sudden disloyalty. Ronnie Turner later struggled with addiction and instability in adulthood, openly acknowledging how growing up around chaos shaped his own challenges. Ike Turner died in December 2007 at age 76, largely isolated. His death did not bring reconciliation. It closed a chapter without resolution. His legacy remains split. On one side, undeniable musical innovation that helped launch modern rock and R&B; on the other, a family history marked by avoidance, fractured relationships, and emotional survival. For his children, the lesson was painfully clear. Genius can change music forever, but it does not excuse fear at home, and it does not guarantee forgiveness once childhood has passed. Ray Charles. Ray Charles was celebrated as a genius who transformed American music by blending gospel, blues, jazz, and soul into a sound that felt raw and human. Blind by the age of 7, he turned loss into artistry and built a career that produced more than 60 studio albums, multiple Grammy Awards, and a catalog that still defines emotional honesty in music. To the world, Ray Charles represented warmth, freedom, and expressive depth. To many of his children, however, fatherhood followed a far more structured and distant design. Ray Charles fathered 12 children with at least 9 different women over several decades. He never denied their existence. In fact, he took pride in acknowledging every child legally and financially. Housing, education, monthly stipends, and trust funds were carefully arranged. By any material standard, he fulfilled his obligations. Yet multiple children later described a relationship shaped by management rather than closeness. Access to their father was regulated through assistance schedules and formal arrangements. Visits were brief, supervised, and rare. Spontaneity was absent. Family gatherings almost never included all siblings at once. Birthdays were acknowledged from a distance. Holidays were spent apart. Several children have said they never experienced a moment where Ray Charles was simply dad without layers of structure in between. This was not neglect in the traditional sense. It was emotional compartmentalization. Ray believed strict separation was necessary to avoid chaos in a life already crowded with demands, fame, and responsibility. The consequences became more visible after Ray Charles died in June 2004 at age 73. His estate, estimated at approximately $75 million, entered probate under a complex trust arrangement. Each child received a payout of about $500,000, with the remainder directed toward charitable foundations. While the financial plan was orderly, it reopened emotional wounds. Several children publicly challenged not just the legal structure, but what it represented: decades of emotional distance formalized into paperwork. Ray Charles Jr. later spoke openly about loving his father while acknowledging a painful truth: he knew Ray Charles the icon better than Ray Charles the man. Other children echoed similar feelings. They described learning about their father through recordings, biographies, and public tributes rather than shared memories. The resentment was not rooted in abandonment, cruelty, or abuse. It came from absence, missed conversations, postponed connections, and a relationship filtered through intermediaries. Importantly, none of these accounts portray Ray Charles as malicious. He was disciplined, intentional, and consistent in provision. But emotional restraint practiced over a lifetime left scars just as real as louder forms of harm. Ray Charles taught the world how to feel deeply through music. His family story reveals a quieter contradiction. Vulnerability offered globally but rationed privately. For his children, the lesson was enduring. Money can be inherited, legacy can be celebrated, but presence once withheld can never be reclaimed. Sam Cooke. Sam Cooke was one of the most promising and influential voices in American music before his life was cut tragically short. By the early 1960s, Cooke had already sold millions of records, crossed racial barriers on the pop charts, and become one of the first black artists to demand ownership of his masters and publishing. Songs like "You Send Me" and "A Change Is Gonna Come" made him a symbol of hope, dignity, and upward mobility during the civil rights era. Yet behind the smooth voice and confident public image, his family life was increasingly shaped by distance and unanswered questions. Sam Cooke was a father to young children at the height of his success. As his career expanded, so did the weight he carried: constant touring, business negotiations, multiple financial obligations, and legal pressures tied to publishing rights. According to later family accounts, Cooke was not cruel or dismissive, but he was often absent physically and emotionally. When he was home, his attention was divided. Promises were made with sincerity, then postponed indefinitely. His children sensed tension. They were too young to understand. Learning early that time with their father came in fragments. Everything ended abruptly on December 11th, 1964, when Sam Cooke was shot and killed at the Hacienda Motel in Los Angeles at just 33 years old. Within hours, authorities ruled the death a justifiable homicide. The speed of that conclusion stunned his family. For his children, there was no gradual processing of loss, only headlines, rumors, and silence. They were left without a clear explanation of how or why their father died, a void that grew heavier with time. How does a child grieve when the truth itself is treated as a secret? As they grew older, Cooke's children encountered multiple conflicting versions of the events surrounding his death. Managers, relatives, journalists, and strangers all offered narratives, none of them complete, none fully trusted. The absence of a definitive account became its own form of trauma. The resentment that followed was not directed at Sam Cooke himself. By most accounts, his children did not blame him for dying. What they struggled with was the silence imposed afterward, the decision by adults to withhold clarity in the name of protection. Financial disputes further complicated grief. Control of Cooke's estate shifted repeatedly over the years, leading to legal battles that reopened emotional wounds. Yet those conflicts were symptoms, not causes. The deeper damage came from unresolved questions and emotional closure that never arrived. Public tributes celebrated Sam Cooke as a visionary who gave voice to a movement. Inside his family, admiration existed alongside confusion and quiet anger. Sam Cooke's music continues to inspire generations, standing as a soundtrack to progress and hope. But his family story reveals a painful truth. Losing a parent is devastating, yet losing them without answers leaves a wound that time does not easily heal. For his children, the legacy was not just a catalog of timeless songs. It was a mystery that followed them into adulthood, shaping how they understood trust, truth, and absence. Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson was not just famous. He was one of the most examined human beings in modern history. By the time he became a father in the late 1990s, he had already sold over 400 million records worldwide, faced years of legal scrutiny, and lived under a level of public surveillance few could imagine. Fatherhood for Michael Jackson became both refuge and responsibility. Those closest to him consistently described him as affectionate, attentive, and emotionally engaged with his children. He read with them, played with them, and emphasized kindness, creativity, and education. Yet love alone could not neutralize the consequences of raising children inside a global legend. Jackson's parenting was built around protection. His children, Prince Paris and Blanket, were raised behind gates, security teams, masks, and carefully controlled routines. Privacy was non-negotiable. Ordinary experiences, walking freely in public, forming unsupervised friendships, blending into a crowd, were largely absent. Childhood unfolded in curated spaces, designed to minimize exposure and danger. At the time, those measures were widely viewed as necessary. But protection came with a cost. When Michael Jackson died suddenly in June 2009 at age 50, that protective structure collapsed overnight. His children lost not only their father, but the controlled world that had defined their reality. They were thrust into public view, while still grieving, expected to carry a legacy they had been shielded from understanding fully. The emotional impact surfaced gradually. Paris Jackson, in particular, later spoke openly about depression, identity struggles, and the exhaustion of growing up watched. In 2013, she was hospitalized following a suicide attempt, an event that shocked the public and revealed how fragile the transition had been. Importantly, Jackson's children have never described him as abusive or neglectful. On the contrary, they have consistently defended him as gentle and devoted. Their pain has centered on circumstance, not cruelty. They mourned not the absence of care, but the absence of normalcy. The isolation that once felt safe became confining once he was gone. Each child responded differently, some retreating from attention, others confronting it directly, but all carried a burden far heavier than their years. Michael Jackson's legacy remains unparalleled. His music reshaped pop culture, race performance, and global entertainment. Yet his family story adds a quieter layer to that legacy. It shows how fame can distort even the most loving intentions, how protection can become confinement, and how children raised inside a myth must eventually step into a world that refuses to see them as ordinary. For his children, the hardest truth was not losing their father. It was learning how to live outside the walls built to keep him safe. R. Kelly. R. Kelly spent decades at the center of modern R&B, selling more than 75 million records worldwide and shaping the sound of 1990s and early 2000s black popular music. To the public, he was a hitmaker whose songs dominated radio weddings and award shows. To his only child, however, fame eventually became something to escape rather than inherit. R. Kelly's relationship with his daughter unfolded not through constant presence, but through distant secrecy and the weight of allegations that grew louder as she grew older. Joanne Kelly, born in 1998 to R. Kelly and dancer Andrea Lee, spent much of her childhood shielded from her father's public life. As early accusations surfaced in the early 2000s, explanations within the family were limited. Silence often replaced clarity. By the time Joanne reached her teenage years, headlines had already tied her identity to claims she neither created nor controlled. Classmates, strangers, and online commentary blurred the line between her father's actions and her own existence. According to her later statements, she felt trapped inside a narrative she was never given tools to understand. As investigations intensified again in 2017 to 2018, Joanne made a decision that shocked the public but brought her peace. She publicly severed ties with her father, stopped using his surname, and rejected financial support. Her message was clear: remaining connected would require minimizing the harm alleged by multiple women, something she refused to do. Importantly, Joanne has never claimed personal abuse by her father. Her stance was rooted in identity and conscience, not retaliation. When a parent's name becomes a burden, does loyalty demand silence or separation? Walking away carried real consequences. Joanne lost access to financial security and faced criticism from those who believed family loyalty should override public accountability. Yet she remained firm. In 2021, R. Kelly was convicted in federal court on racketeering and sex trafficking charges. In 2022, he received additional convictions related to child exploitation and obstruction, resulting in a combined sentence exceeding 30 years in prison. These verdicts confirmed what Joanne had already chosen years earlier: distance before denial became impossible. Psychologists often note that children of disgraced public figures experience a unique form of trauma shame without responsibility, judgment without agency, and pressure to defend actions they did not commit. Joanne's response illustrates one path through that maze. She did not attempt to rewrite history or argue legacy. She chose refusal, not rage, not spectacle. Quiet separation. R. Kelly's musical influence is now inseparable from his criminal record. For his daughter, the story was never about charts, punishment, or redemption. It was about survival in the shadow of a man whose choices reshaped her life without her consent. Sometimes hatred does not arrive as anger. Sometimes it appears as distance chosen deliberately, so a child can remain whole when a parent's legacy makes that impossible. Donny Hathaway. Donny Hathaway is remembered as one of the most refined and emotionally intelligent voices in soul music. Trained in classical piano and composition, he stood apart not only for how he sang, but for how carefully he structured sound. His work in the early 1970s, including A Song for You and This Christmas, demonstrated rare musical discipline and sensitivity. To listeners, Hathaway sounded calm, thoughtful, and deeply present. Privately, however, his life was increasingly shaped by a serious mental illness that neither the industry nor those around him fully understood at the time. By the mid-1970s, Hathaway had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, a condition marked by delusions, extreme anxiety, and periods of disconnection from reality. Friends and collaborators later described how he became convinced he was being watched, sabotaged, or targeted. Recording sessions were interrupted. Trust eroded. Medication was prescribed, but inconsistently maintained. Instead of stepping away from professional pressure to stabilize his health, Hathaway was often encouraged to keep working as if productivity could outrun illness. During this period, his daughters were still young. They did not understand diagnoses or treatment plans. What they experienced was a father who was sometimes warm and present, then suddenly distant, fearful, or emotionally unreachable. Adults spoke around the problem rather than addressing it directly. Explanations were softened or delayed. As Hathaway withdrew, confusion replaced security. The silence surrounding his condition left his children sensing danger without language to name it. On January 13, 1979, Donny Hathaway fell from the window of his hotel room in New York City and died at just 33 years old. The death was ruled a suicide. The case closed quickly. For his daughters, it never truly did. Grief was complicated by anger not toward their father, but toward the system that failed him. Over time, their questions sharpened. Why was a man with a known severe mental illness left alone in a hotel room? Why were warning signs treated as inconveniences rather than emergencies? Why was touring prioritized over care? As adults, Hathaway's daughters have spoken publicly to challenge the romanticized narrative that framed his suffering as artistic temperament. They emphasized that schizophrenia is not destiny when treatment is consistent and humane. Their frustration was not rooted in resentment of their father's legacy, but in the belief that his death was preventable. What hurt most was not simply losing him, but knowing he struggled visibly while support remained fragmented. Donny Hathaway's music continues to comfort millions, offering warmth, clarity, and emotional balance. That contrast makes his family story especially painful. A man who brought structure to sound was denied stability in life. For his children, the lasting wound was not hatred of who he was, but refusal to excuse the neglect that surrounded him. His legacy, they insist, should include a final correction. Brilliance deserves care, not abandonment, and silence is never a substitute for treatment. Curtis Mayfield. Curtis Mayfield stood as one of the moral voices of American music. From People Get Ready to Move On Up. His songs carried messages of dignity, resilience, and collective uplift during decades of racial and social upheaval. Mayfield sold millions of records, earned critical acclaim as a songwriter and producer, and helped define the sound of socially conscious soul and funk. To the public, his music sounded hopeful and forward-looking. Inside his family, however, later years were shaped by a reality far heavier than any lyric. On August 13, 1990, during a rehearsal at Wingate Field in Brooklyn, a lighting tower collapsed in a sudden storm and struck Mayfield, leaving him paralyzed from the neck down. He survived, but his life changed permanently. From that moment on, Curtis Mayfield required constant assistance, respiratory care, repositioning to prevent infections, pain management, and round-the-clock support. Though mentally sharp, he lost all physical independence. Medical bills mounted quickly, and long-term professional care proved limited and expensive, even for a man with a celebrated career. His family stepped in. Children, relatives, and caregivers reorganized their lives around survival. Homes were modified. Schedules disappeared. What began as emergency response slowly became permanent responsibility. Love was present, but so was exhaustion. Caregiving stretched from months into years, and the emotional toll grew heavier with time. Decisions about treatment finances and daily care created tension. Some family members carried more responsibility than others, leading to quiet resentment that few felt allowed to admit. How long can devotion survive when care becomes endless and support remains inadequate? Importantly, the strain that emerged was not directed at Curtis Mayfield himself. Family members consistently expressed admiration and respect for him as a father and artist. The conflict arose from circumstance, not character. America celebrates survival stories but rarely acknowledges the cost of surviving without a safety net. Caregiving became a full-time burden without full-time resources. Emotional fatigue accumulated silently. Conversations grew difficult. Distance replaced dialogue, not from lack of love, but from depletion. Curtis Mayfield continued composing music despite his paralysis, recording vocals line by line while lying flat on his back. That perseverance inspired the public, but privately, it also reinforced expectations that endurance was the only acceptable response. When Mayfield died on December 26, 1999, after nearly a decade of paralysis, grief arrived tangled with complex emotions. Relief existed alongside sorrow. Guilt followed exhaustion. Some family members later acknowledged feeling judged for those feelings, as if suffering quietly were the price of loyalty. Mayfield's legacy remains powerful. His music still urges listeners to rise, resist, and believe. Yet his family story adds an uncomfortable layer to that legacy. It reveals how prolonged survival, when undersupported, can erode even strong bonds. For his children, the lesson was not about abandoning a parent. It was about recognizing that love alone cannot replace systems of care. Curtis Mayfield sang about moving on up. His family learned how heavy that climb can be when carried alone, and how silence about that burden can wound just as deeply as loss itself. Prince built his life and career around absolute autonomy, a musical prodigy who wrote, produced, and performed at a level few artists ever approach. Prince released more than 35 studio albums, sold over 100 million records worldwide, and redefined what creative ownership could look like for a black artist in America. From the outside, his independence looked like freedom perfected. Inside his personal life, that same control gradually created distance that family members would later describe as painful and unresolved. Prince had no surviving children, but he was not without family. Siblings, half-siblings, and extended relatives existed on the edges of his world, often separated from him by strict boundaries, intermediaries, and layers of security. Paisley Park, his Minnesota compound, functioned as both a creative sanctuary and a fortress. Access was limited. Communication was filtered. Even those related by blood often described interactions that felt formal, infrequent, and tightly managed. Privacy was not simply a preference, it was a governing principle. As Prince grew older, those boundaries hardened. He reduced interviews, withdrew socially, and relied on a small inner circle. Family members later said attempts to connect frequently went unanswered or were redirected through staff. Conversations were postponed. Visits were rare. There was no public feud, no dramatic rupture, just a quiet widening of space. In life, Prince controlled everything. In doing so, he left little room for emotional repair. That distance became impossible to ignore after Prince died suddenly on April 21, 2016, at age 57. He left no will despite an estate estimated at over $150 million. Overnight, relatives who had spent years on the periphery were pulled into a highly public legal battle. Grief unfolded not in private moments, but in court filings, depositions, and public scrutiny. The absence of clear instructions turned silence into conflict. As probate proceedings dragged on, resentment surfaced not over Prince's music or achievements, but over exclusion. Some family members spoke openly about feeling locked out while he was alive, only to be summoned once assets were at stake. Others remained quiet, but the message was consistent. The control Prince maintained in life became confusion in death. Decisions he once dictated with precision were now negotiated by lawyers. Importantly, no family member accused Prince of cruelty or malice. The narrative that emerged was more unsettling. He had chosen solitude as protection from exploitation, distraction, and loss of control. It preserved his art and safeguarded his identity. But it also guaranteed unfinished relationships. The walls he built were effective, too effective. Prince's public legacy remains pristine, unmatched musicianship, fearless independence, and total artistic freedom. Yet his family's story complicates that image. It shows how privacy, when absolute, can deny closure, and how control, when perfected, leaves no margin for reconciliation. Those left behind did not inherit shared memories formed freely. They inherited access negotiated legally. Prince once sang about love, unity, and spiritual connection. His final lesson was quieter and harder. Isolation can succeed brilliantly until it outlives the person who chose it. These stories leave us with no easy answers. They force us to confront a truth many fans avoid. Greatness can coexist with damage, and silence inside a family can echo louder than applause. Were these children disloyal, or were they honest about wounds fame never healed? Does artistic genius excuse emotional absence, or does it make accountability even more necessary? At Legends of Black Excellence, we don't erase legacy, we examine its full weight. Now the question is yours to answer. How should history remember legends whose music healed millions, but whose homes carried unresolved pain that still demands reflection today?